let me proceed with what I'm going to talk about tonight. Oops. Okay. One of the things that I'm doing in a number of school districts across the country is beginning to look at how these demographic shifts are impacting particularly public schools. Our country is increasing in population, it's increasing in diversity, and it's increasing in segregation. And this change is happening primarily in the suburbs. So as I left here and went over to my hotel, I passed through what appeared to be several different communities. I believe there was Yiddish written on several buildings with no subtitles, so I really couldn't tell if that's what it was, but I think it was. There were several African Americans that I encountered in different places, kind of between here and there. There was a Latino community that appeared to be here that I, again, encountered. And that kind of diversity mix is pulsing all over the country, and again, primarily in the suburbs. So one of the things that's of interest to me is this demographic shift. In Washington, D.C., there's an interesting dynamic that's going on there where it's not the flight out of Washington, it's the migration into Washington. And a number of white families are moving back into traditional African American communities. A number of same-gender families are moving into Capitol Hill, DuPont, obviously that's kind of the center of the gay community, but moving out into around Howard University. All of this then is coming into primarily the public schools, and in many cases there is no infrastructure to address what those changes mean or how we teach the children. In fact, I shared with the students today in a school not far from Howard University. If you're familiar with Washington, it's again kind of the heart of the city in some ways. Teacher who had been in the school for 18 years, an elementary school. And she said, you know, the change was interesting, but it terrorized her. And I said, what does that mean? She said, well, I think white families will come into the school and judge me, and they won't want me to teach their child. And we're in a group where obviously people felt safe to talk, and I looked around, everybody was nodding their head. I took that to mean that there was a lot of conversation we need to have because that change is coming and you need to get ready. I went on to, that day I visited 2 other schools, and because of that kind of earlier conversation, I shared that with other teachers. And in a school, again, on Capitol Hill, a veteran teacher of 8 years in the district, white teacher said, and this is the first year I have a white child in my class, elementary school teacher. We began to talk about it, and I said, and so what does it feel like to teach this white child for the first time in your career? As a white woman, are you relating? She said it was a different experience. It occurs to me that this whole dynamic of diversity kind of took me back. It took me back to the days when blatant segregation was kind of everywhere, that there were rules written and signs put up and people excluded, and inferior kind of learning situations. Signs like this, and this is in my lifetime. So this isn't ancient history, well, maybe. But this was something that I witnessed kind of the tail end of, but it was in my lifetime. But this had to be very intentional. Ordinances were written, and neighborhoods were defined, and in some cases, neighborhoods were dispersed. And across the United States and in other countries, these kinds of signs and notions went up that made it very clear that some areas were not places for folks to go if they valued their safety. So we have this interesting dynamic of growing diversity, growing segregation, and this quiet creep, I feel, back to the days when, before Brown versus Board of Education and whatnot, when there was very kind of blatant segregation. Now, there aren't a lot of signs like those I showed you around, but the effect is still the same, that we are gradually creeping back to a time when certain groups were excluded, certain groups were included. In my own state of Illinois, we have witnessed a change in the student population, such that now in the 8,600 school districts in Illinois, there is a minority-majority population. And you can see there the kind of gradual decline of white students and the increase of Latinos, African Americans, Asians, multiracial students. And it's happening fairly quickly from, well, 10 years. You can see a majority school district that's white to a majority school district that is other than white. So as I've been working in Illinois, I've been working in Texas and DC and other places, the question arises, so what does that mean? What does it mean in terms of how we teach? Do we teach differently? Do we embrace students differently? Do we change in some way? The school boards in Texas are at their wits' end. There are many, many districts that are now majority Latino. There are also many other kinds of people coming into the Texas school system outside of Dallas. They've relocated people from Burma, Myanmar. They've relocated them into the suburbs of Dallas. The Red Cross has brought thousands. In the suburbs of Dallas now you have Burmese refugees, you have corporate America that's moving down into the Dallas suburbs because they can get land, which they can't in Manhattan. You have the service industry, Latinos and African Americans. You have growing poverty. And into these districts, they begin to ask questions, what does this mean in terms of how we teach, how we run our schools? This is Westchester County. And unfortunately, the legend you can't see, but if you'll watch this is in terms of race, in like a 20-year period, Westchester County changes dramatically. And again, in terms of poverty, it's not too far from here, right? Is that somewhere? Poverty growing in pockets, the deep blue pockets, moving around. So not only do we have this kind of increase of English language learners, race, we also have an increase of children with learning disabilities, both diagnosed and undiagnosed. We have all kinds of dynamics that impact diversity, and each one kind of requiring us to step back and look. And I think the one that perhaps is going to catch us off guard the most is poverty. Because there are now more districts where 60, 70, 80, 90% of the students are on free and reduced lunch. And to me, it suggests that students are coming to school to eat first, and then if you have to open a book, fine, but they get 3 meals at school. Some get backpacks to take home with them over the weekend. That is their dinner, whatever, for a couple of days. They come back to school to be fed again. The Senate just passed the Farm Aid Bill, which has food stamps in it, close to, I don't know how much, but a lot of money. So there's some slight recognition that poverty is growing, people need to eat. But again, what does that mean in terms of how we teach, how our schools are? So this is a place that I worked with the faculty last year, and I wanted to share it with you tonight. Because I think there's a notion that with greater diversity comes greater academic decline. And actually what the research is showing us is that as the diversity increases in our schools, so does the academic well-being, the academic excellence. A woman by the name of Patricia Guerin out of Ann Arbor provided Justice O'Connor with these rationales that was used in the Michigan case, both the undergraduate and law school, why diversity is important, a factor. And what Guerin found was a couple of things. One, for students who were in a controlled diversity environment, and by that she meant they were in a class that was a semester long, the students got credit for it. Every day they would come in, they would engage in discussion, they would talk about their lives, they would do some of the things you all did, they would do some of the things the students did today, they talked about gender, race, etc. They learned how to talk across difference. They learned the experiences and impressions of other people. And at the end of the semester, they ran a kind of a cognitive kind of map on the students and found that there was somewhere in the equivalent of a 14-point gain in terms of their cognitive skills and abilities. Similarly, they looked at the affective gains from the students. You know, how are they impacted by being in this group? By things like, how do they adjust to change? Or how do they respond to difference? Or what is their motivation? Or kind of what about them, their value system, is impacted? And they found, again, some pretty startling gains. They also wanted to see how these students responded to issues of inequality. So if they saw something happening in the school, were they more likely to be impacted by that than the control group? And again, you can see the data there. Pre and post test in a control group wasn't moved as much as was the group that was engaged in this cross-difference dialogue. This one perhaps is the most important of them all. Not only were they aware of inequality, but they had a proclivity to act. They wanted to do something about it. They wanted to get engaged. They wanted to change what was happening. A number of the students, for instance, after having gone through what they call the IGR, they wanted to go out in the community and do something, change the circumstance. Several of the students went into Detroit, went block by block to do a survey of healthcare provision. Others wanted to figure out how much hunger there was in the city, and they did another kind of sample. But many of them felt moved to act. Not only do I now communicate across difference, but I feel like I need to do something based on the experience I've had. And empathy grew. So this is, in my experience, a departure from how we have done diversity probably for the last 50 years. When I was a high school student, I integrated Roosevelt High School in Seattle. I was one of 9 students. Student body of 2,500, probably the most academically oriented high school in Seattle. Go Seahawks. It sits about a mile from the University of Washington. You know, it just had a high kind of college growing rate. But there was nothing that we did when I arrived there that engendered any kindness, understanding, anything between the 9 African American students and the 2,490 white students. We went to school every day. I was called the N-word every day. I mean, I made great friends, but there was no conscious effort to do anything other than go to school, and the magic of integration will happen. Well, the magic of integration eventually did happen. I have several good friends, but nowhere near what could have happened had we been thoughtful, we'd been intentional, if we had dug deep into the experience. I mean, lots of stories. But one I remember, which I shared on NPR when I was interviewed when Seattle and Louisville went to the Supreme Court. I was walking down the hall with Julie Penger. I can almost tell you the time of day. We were walking down the hall. And like high school students, we were hugging, we were kind of holding hands. And the vice principal comes up to me and says, Carter, meet me in the office. Mama, go to the office, I'll meet you there. First period passes. Second period passes. Third period, he shows up, brings me into his office and says, that's not why we brought you here. We didn't bring you here to whatever with white girls or whatever he said. I can't remember his exact words. But the message was pretty clear. You're here to go to class and go home, and that's all we want. Play basketball, but that's all we want. Those experiences are kind of, they stick with kids, and I would imagine there are probably students who are graduates of Green Meadow that have had all kinds of experiences. It'd be very interesting to go back and talk to several of the kids of color, some of the gay students and others about their experience here. Was there empathy? Was there understanding? Did we create a safe environment? I think the new level, the new technology of diversity is that we do something with that difference, because in the future, and I shared that with the students today, that's going to be your life. This was in my lifetime, and this costs money, okay? Like to have separate water fountains, like to have the signs to... So it wasn't benign. And I think equally important is how we move forward on some of the things we know exist out there. The achievement gap is something that researchers talk about all the time. That there is this disparity, and it almost seems unapproachable. It seems cast in stone. Well, one of the things we know is that it is not, in fact, cast in stone, that it is approachable, and there is a way for us to deal with it. The very first thing I do in the school district I work in is I ask them to give me the data. I mean, show me what is happening here. And invariably, you'll see something like this. You know, where African American students or Latinos trade spots kind of with a double-digit disparity. And by the way, some of this data is coming from independent schools, so we're not immune from disparities. But I think once we get our hands on the data, then we can begin to see. So how do we close gaps? And there is an emerging body of information around gap closing. And it has very little to do with academic preparation. Almost all the research that you will find says that it has to do with relationships. And if students and teachers can form relationships, bond, that the students can go wherever you would like them to go. For African Americans, 78% of their academic achievement is related to the teacher they're with. They learn for the teacher. For white students, it's about 34%. When you have that kind of gap, which says, I'm going to see if she likes me, or I'm going to work for her because she does like me. I mean, that's huge. Again, much of this is replicating the research. There is so much data on this, there's even an acronym, TSQR, which stands for Teacher-Student Quality of Relationship. And if you dig deep into that research, you'll find names that come up all the time. Bob Pianata, Bridget Ombre, others, Wade Boynton. They're all finding the same thing. If we could forge strong relationships, then the students will rise to our expectations. So if expectations and relationships are at the core of achievement, how do we do that? And I think, again, this is part of the new wave of knowledge that's coming out around diversity. It's not enough to bring the children in. We certainly bring them in, and then we build strong relationships, we have high expectations, and we let them know that. And time again, we go back to that. We don't have this expectation for one group of kids and that for the other. We level it. We teach that way. We have a pedagogy of inclusion, and then that starts to impact their achievement. And by the way, that's not just kids of color. We heard today from students that maybe have a gender element to it. So how do we level expectations around gender? I would imagine it has something to do with LD students and others. Students maybe with mild autism, students with other kinds of conditions. Is our expectation. We raise expectations, we raise achievement. Now, for public schools, that's their bread and butter, right? Because they all are in some testing regime or something, and pretty much public and whatnot. Independent schools, less so, although I think much of what I've just suggested applies to independent schools as well. I brought some student voices, but I don't think I can get them to come on. But I think when we transferred the PowerPoint, the student voices didn't come up. But these are students who attended a conference that I conduct annually. It's middle school students. We talk about diversity. This particular conference is in Washington, D.C. It's held last week of January of every year. We train students for about 3 months to run it, to identify the topics, to identify the speakers. They kind of have that day to run the conference. There were 800 roughly students who attended this conference. We do them all over the country. But what impresses me toward the end of the day is when we give the mic back to the students and ask them to reflect on their learning or whatever they want to say. Invariably, many of them say that I didn't realize that diversity was X, Y, and Z. I didn't know it was so many things. I didn't know it was more than race. I didn't realize that this was diversity and that I have that particular identity. And it makes me think that we need to do structured work around diversity because it's going to be as critical as anything the students will leave any of our schools with. How do I work across difference? How do I identify myself? What do I do when I encounter inequity? Do I act on my own? Do I gather as others? How do I? And all of those things are lessons our students can learn. So one of the things that I'm working on beyond just kind of talking about it is thinking about what does it mean? What does it mean in the classroom? What does it mean in the homes? What's out there on the horizon? I've come across a body of literature called Diversity Responsive Pedagogy that I'm working with faculty in many areas on because I think it speaks to the need that we have right now. And in the context of diversity responsive pedagogy, we are preparing ourselves for diversity we don't even know that's coming. 10 years ago, we wouldn't have thought 1 in 28 students on the autism spectrum. In 10 years, what other kind of diversity will be in our classrooms? So diversity responsive pedagogy is a way of beginning to prepare ourselves for the students that are coming. And increasingly, I'm saying to students, you need to know how you learn. So that you'll know when the teacher is hitting it right for you, and you can say to them, look, I'm a tactile learner, okay? Or I'm a visual learner, or I learn best when X. And as an informed consumer, you can engage with the school around how you best learn. Same for parents. And increasingly, I see us moving more toward method, a little bit more towards content, but at the top of it is a student-teacher relationship. I think there are also implications in this growing diversity for the home. How much do our children know about who they are and their identity? Is it something we talk about all the time? How much do they know about others? And here is where I think the notion of intentional diversity is really critical. Who is in our living rooms? Who is sitting at our dining room table? Who do we go on vacations with? Who do we fill in the blank? If it's not in our home, how important is it? And I think we can really talk a great game about how we believe in this and that and the other, but I think our kids watch to see who's sitting at the dining room table. And they're gay folks, black folks, Jewish folks, Muslim folks, all kinds of folks. I think it sends a message. When I was growing up, my father was very active in the civil rights movement. And he was a social worker who later became the first secretary of the Anti-Bias Board for Washington State, which made him the first African American to hold a statewide position appointed by the governor. His job was to travel the state and investigate discrimination, housing discrimination, job discrimination, education, everything. Only now, as a grown adult, can I imagine some of the places he went and how scary it must have been. Because in the far eastern part of Washington State is where the neo-Nazis established a kind of a foothold. There, northern Idaho, Montana, there was this whole movement to have kind of a white nation up in the northwest corner of the country. And I can imagine he encountered some of that and how scary that must have been. So in our home, around the dinner table, were conversations like that. And when he got the position and we tried to move down to Olympia, the state capital, we experienced redlining. A house that was for sale on Tuesday all of a sudden got sold on Wednesday when we showed up to make an offer. It got so bad that we had Jewish friends front for us until it came time to sign at the closing and the offer was off the table. This black-Jewish dynamic in Seattle was really formidable. It was a critical point for both cultures to figure out how we solve this together. My church and the big synagogue in Seattle were 2 blocks apart. We could have been worlds apart if the leaders hadn't figured out how to come together. But I remember having Jewish and white colleagues in the house, and it just became matter of fact after a while. And I think that definitely said something about our values. I think if we are not intentional about this diversity, this whole creep thing around segregation is going to come straight back. So one of the things I think about is in relationship building, how do we as adults and some of the students here be more intentional about who is in that circle with us? We talked today, students and I, about friendships from students who have been together since kindergarten and they've been together for 10, 11, 12 years, 12 out of 24 and whatnot, and how many friends do I have who haven't been here that long and are outside that circle? And a couple of students were very honest. They said, look, how do I do that? How do I make friendships outside of the circle of my comfort zone? I think the implications for homeschool go to feedback and to the opportunity to reflect and think critically. Very little of what happens at home has to do with homework. In fact, it should have probably nothing to do with school. I mean, certainly we help our kids, but that's not how they will grow intellectually and in terms of their spirit. It has more to do with some of these other things that I've mentioned here. So, I'm going to stop in a minute. What I think about when I think about Green Meadow Waldorf School, when I think about the changing dynamics and demographics in this part of the world, right here, 5-mile radius, when I think about what some of the things Steiner stood for and where the whole Waldorf school thing is going, I think there's a role for this school and this community to do some brokering of relationships, to bring all kinds of difference together and have it engage. And it's messy, but I think that kind of commitment would be something that the students could learn a great deal from. If students from the public schools and others were invited into this space and begin to engage one another, and I know some of that goes on, there can be all kinds of growth, and I think it speaks highly of what this community is about. I think, and some of the things we'll be talking to the faculty about, is how do you have expectations that raise all kids to high achievement? And there are techniques, there's training that the faculty can have that really helps them get to that point. I think there's also training for parents. I think there's a whole parent ed piece around diversity that's not what it used to be, which is coming into a room and being humiliated and whatnot. I mean, that's part of the legacy of diversity work, and I own that. But I think where we're going to now is a more skill-based approach. What do I need to know, even at my stage in life, to be more effective in a highly diverse setting? And I think, again, as the students grow up here, leave here, and go on, embracing some of these things, put them in a leadership position, which I think is badly needed.